So good morning and welcome, and really excited to speak to you all today. As you know, I lead the marketing team, so I kind of represent, for Gigya, so I kind of represent kind of the other side of the customer equation, which I think in many of the discussions, we kind of really focus in on the privacy and security elements of this slide. But really, in the consumer world, you actually typically start in an anonymous state, or maybe in a completely unknown way altogether, right? So how do we move that customer to a point where we can actually worry about protecting their information, and hopefully, ultimately, that's actually success. Those are like the good problems to have, because most organizations, certainly in the startup world, start up with no customers. And how do we build from that unknown world into a known state? So I always like to kind of recenter around something that's a pretty common concept for marketers, which is this concept of the customer journey, right? Where you start from that anonymous state, hopefully you do some analysis, you're learning about the market, you find out companies, you do research, and eventually you move down that chain and become a customer and actually really focus in. And I think a lot of the discussion is around this concept of access management, identity proofing. But really, if you think about it, that actually represents a fairly narrow portion of the overall customer experience. And I think there's a huge opportunity for identity, and particularly customer identity, to play a role across this entire journey, from the very initial interaction point around awareness, right through to creating brand advocates and hopefully repeat customers that are coming back, right? So I don't want to minimize the importance of the access management portion of it, but if you get to that point, you've actually done really well. That's really exciting. And really, privacy and security needs to be across this entire journey, this entire process, right? So if you think about the stakeholders you need to work with, I know a lot of us come from an employee world, right? We're dealing with internal stakeholders, and as an employee, if I want to access benefits, my email, internal systems, I get a paycheck, I have to use those systems, right? In the customer world, they don't have to do anything you want them to, right? I really enjoyed Christian's talk yesterday about utility and kind of that whole concept of behavioral economics, right? Like at the end of the day, the whole idea is to hopefully provide enough utility to that consumer that they say, yes, I want to volunteer my information. So how do we progressively get to know somebody? I know when I met many of you, I didn't immediately start off by providing my social security number and my address. It was a little less formal than that. In a customer journey, typically you don't start with the most sensitive information. You start with a slightly different concept. But again, there is this data paradox that we've been hearing about, right? We did a study of over 4,000 consumers in the United States and the United Kingdom. And we found more than 2/3 actually don't trust brands with their data, right? And this is a challenge because really at the end of the day, if you think about some marketing concepts like omni-channel customer experience, so moving across devices and web properties and everything else, and how you actually service that customer, if you don't want to give me information, a lot of the time it becomes very challenging for me to provide that consistent cross-channel experience, right? And you get all these crazy inferential or predictive technologies that we think with an 80% chance that that iPhone belongs to Jason, so let me serve them up a particular advertisement. And a lot of the ad tech industry and MarTech industry is actually device-centric rather than consumer-centric. I think these are questions.
Yeah, so I see the responses here, unconcerned, neither, and concerned. To me, that seems pretty binary. You're concerned or you're not. So I'm just really curious about the source of the data. How did they come up with neither concerned nor unconcerned?
It was a pick list in the response. How concerned are you about companies handling your information? Concerned, unconcerned, neither.
Okay, so neither is more like ambivalent.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. But the interesting thing is again, as consumers kind of think about their information, they do believe that they are the best custodians of that information in many cases, right? So we can see, again, almost 2/3 felt like, as an individual, I'm responsible for my data privacy, versus the brands that they interact with and the government. And again, the interesting thing is between the US and UK, these numbers didn't change very much. The UK folks weren't relying on their government to really protect these identities. And then the other thing we found is that when consumers are informed about a data breach, they actually do take action. And this was really interesting. So when given the opportunity, and again, if you think about most websites and most things you interact with, you really don't, it's not obvious how you do some of these things, but consumers really will. They'll go in, they'll change their password. I know I use two-factor authentication on almost all the sites I use, and I love it when that's presented as an option for me because I feel a little bit safer, more secure. And if you think about that customer journey and that we have this account is a huge success for us, right? We've actually signed with the customer. I actually, as a marketer, found it very disturbing that you could lose a fifth of your customer base will just close the account. I'm gone. I don't want to participate in your service anymore. I don't want to receive any information. I'm shutting it down. So the risk associated with these data breaches, the reputational risk and the cost of the business is extremely high. So if we think about this and kind of bringing back that kind of concept of the customer journey and really moving from the left on the anonymous side to the fully known and all the data attributes we collect about the customer, how do we coax the customer along this journey? And there's a few interesting things to, I'm wondering if, there we go. So anonymous interaction. So a lot of those cookie consents that kind of come up on the web page that you see really are pretty transitory. They come up, it's not really stored anywhere. It really is just, yep, this device ID has clicked that particular button. But really that's the first interaction many of you will have with the customer, right? So beginning to understand what's the device, where did the person come from, store this information, and almost beginning to build that profile and that identity right at that point. And then being able to do things like light registration. So if any of you subscribe to CNN and actually want to get a news alert and you put in your email address and you say, I'm really interested in domestic or international news, or I want to put in a phone number to receive text updates, that's actually all powered by Gigya. And we're able to begin, again, that kind of concept of what we call light registration. And really, it can be as simple as, hey, subscribe to our newsletter, we'll give you some information in exchange for that email address. And again, there's no password, there's no additional piece of information here, but again, it's beginning to build that relationship and that trust with the consumer for a value exchange. And I can't wait to get my hands on the new iPhone X, so looking forward to that. Then we move into full registration, right? Which is where now the customer says, hey, you know what? I'm willing to move from my anonymous state and move into a state where now we can actually begin to verify that identity. We can provide a number of different social login techniques potentially to remove friction from that process. Because again, when presented with one of these screens, that consumer can simply exit and not participate in your service. So the idea being that you want that experience to be as seamless and as part of your brand experience as possible. And you need to make sure that that process is as friction-free for the customer on the device, or the way they want to interact with you is absolutely crucial. So I think the gentleman from Capital One who talked about becoming an IDP, again, being able to provide, hey, there's my Capital One button. That's what I want to use to log into this site. But I might go to another retailer and go, you know what, that's too high a level of assurance. I'm just going to use Facebook and I'm going to go in that way on some of the more fun sites as described earlier. So really making, and at that point, this is where we really can start to build up a really great relationship with the customer through something called progressive profiling. So that ability now to present options to consumers where they can reveal more about themselves. What are your preferences in terms of television shows or types of trips you'd like to take, or again, the relevant experiences for your brand. So Vogue down in Australia actually uses this progressive profiling technique on their site to really, hey, take this survey, have a look at what the favorite colors of the fall are going to be, and receive an award from Vogue. And then kind of building up that knowledge of the customer, but again, building that entire brand experience where the customer identity is really at the center. And then as we think about enriching these profiles, identity doesn't live in isolation. This customer information needs to be used across an entire digital stack. I don't know how many of you caught Brand's presentation last night. He's the CMO of Americas for Microsoft, and he had his customer journey laid out with his technology stack. Again, this customer information is the currency for great customer experiences across an entire digital ecosystem. So really, the onus is on us to make sure that we use the data responsibly, that we are transparent with the customer, but we still have a job to do. We still have to provide a great customer experience across our digital stacks. Now, interestingly, with GDPR and many of the privacy regulations, this concept of enterprise preference management or enterprise consent management is becoming more and more top of mind. Where do we gather all the consent information together into one place? We're actually working with Bayer right now, who I'm sure most of you are very familiar with. They've identified over 1,800 systems internally that store customer data right now. So if you think about under GDPR, the right to erasure, I want Bayer to forget Jason Rose, that I ever existed. 1,800 systems need to be checked to see if my information are contained within there. So how do we begin to centralize some of this data? So if we think about kind of this overall preference and consent framework, really capturing that at the end user level, being able to provide the interfaces, terms of service, cookie policies, all the legalese that are out there, being able to present that in a very nice way through that customer journey lens. But then those things are updated. I mentioned ASOS in one of my panels yesterday. In the past 2 years, they had updated their terms of service like twice, like some minor updates. When GDPR came on the scene, they've updated it 7 times in the last 7 months, right? So think about having to trigger a reconsent. Were the changes big enough that we need to reconsent our user community? And which ones have consented to the new versus the old versus the version 3 becomes quite a challenge and a nightmare. So being able to trigger that as part of, think about this is all part of the user experience. This is not something that's buried in a system and you can send an email to your employees and go, you're locked out of email until you sign this agreement. These are customers. If they don't like what you're doing, they're just going to bail and go somewhere else. And then being able to synchronize that consent to the downstream applications. Again, this data does not live in that. If I unsubscribe from your email, you better not share my information downstream to Marketo and send me emails. And then finally, really presenting that information back to the customer in a very self-service friendly way, right? So again, the user experience really matters here. The information you got about a person, the terms of service, when the privacy policy was agreed, the newsletters and communications I've agreed to, the frequency and timing of those things. There is a lot required of a consumer to view this, but you need to be able to present it back, and hopefully in a mobile-friendly way that 90% of your, or I'm making a number up, a huge percentage of your customers would prefer to be on mobile, so it becomes especially important in that context. And there we go. And really, of course, underpinning all this is that repeat customer experience with the authentication and authorization at the appropriate time. So with that, that's really what I wanted to share with you, really kind of bringing that perspective, the customer journey, the customer experience, and where identity can play across that entire spectrum. So with that, I'll open it up to questions.
Thank you very much. I all found it very interesting, and now I know what your product is. And I should have had that 4 years ago. My life would have been easy. So questions?
Stunned silence.
Totally stunned. Yeah. No, because I find that you are really taking care of these concepts. That's what I said at the beginning of our meeting, that you can't go back every week to them.
That's right.
And my problem was, if you have a website, it's a bit different than with Salesforce or something like Facebook. If you have a site where there's lots of industries in that site, you know, from cars, but also there's, for instance, Vogue is in there.
Yeah.
That's it. So as soon as you get a new application in, you might need to get the consent again. So, and this is what you need to think with designing, and then you have a stack of consents, and you, in the beginning, obviously, you didn't have that many consumers, but it really grows. We had no idea how to do it. We had to develop it ourselves. And so I just didn't think it should be in the identity and access management realm. I don't know where the consent should be, you know, who is in the company who should take care of it.
Well, and it is a cross organization challenge, right? Certainly you've got your legal stakeholders who want
I wanted to put, yeah, they didn't want it. They didn't want it.
and triggering. However, again, you're impacting customer experience. So as a CMO, anything you put in front of the customer, I want to be aware of.
Right.
And I have a role to play to make sure it makes sense, that it's readable, it's legible.
So my CMO,
Yeah.
same thing, he would go berserk, why is there another one now going out? And it's really an issue, yeah, like the yell on P&L bit, you know? But and I think it's very important now with all the changes going on, that you think about these things, because the users, really, I think in the US it's a problem, because they can sue so easily. And in Europe, you can't sue an individual like that. So easily. Is there a question over there? I saw his hand up there for a while. Or you want to go for
You
it?
have the microphone, go ahead.
So a quick question. You showed this progression, and it was a very definite left to right, one directional progression. And I'm just wondering to what extent users, if you have any data about this, users would be okay with taking one step back as opposed to taking like a GDPR, erase everything about me. Like maybe I don't want you to know everything about my preferences, but you can keep the email at some point, send me a newsletter next year or something.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and the customer journey often isn't linear, to your point, but I think for simplification, it kind of gets the point across. To your question about, can I wholesale, I don't want to wholesale remove myself, but maybe I want to update or remove some of the information you have. Absolutely. The right to edit, update, change, or delete the entire profile should be a capability inherent in profile management now, especially as we go into the world of GDPR.
Do you have any data on how many people, if they have that capability, would choose to do that rather than erase everything?
I actually do not. And it's interesting because while profiles have been around for a long time, this concept of being edit, view, update is relatively new. So if anybody in the audience actually has some experience with that, I'd be curious to hear what you're seeing. I think over time that data will become more available as more companies kind of embrace this approach. And I think the other interesting point about this is oftentimes we think about this in a single brand context. Well, Nestle is one of our biggest customers, and they have over 2,000 brands on 5 continents. They deal with agencies who are often setting up microsites and mobile applications on their behalf. And just imagine trying to manage the identity layer and customer journey across not just one brand, but from water to Nespresso to on down the line, right? And really, the team there has set up a core toolkit that they can roll out and provide to each of the regions, and then the agency can do their thing and do the creative, amazing work that they do around that kind of core identity framework.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was talking about. I know him quite well, and we were really saying, we can't do this, we don't know how to do this. I would like to have one question, but then we have to continue.
Yeah.
Although you understand, I like this topic.
It's no problem. It's the same theme that I had yesterday, which was really, how are we bridging the offline activity and those users with their online persona? So in our market, right, we've got salespeople going out in the field, we've got technicians, we've got customer service reps taking calls over the phone. How do we bridge that activity, get it into their profile when we can't necessarily always proxy the user or ghost to them or do things on their behalf without giving them consent, right? They're not actually clicking the box, they're just telling somebody over the phone, oh yeah, I give consent. Are there companies doing this effectively, bridging the offline activity with the online?
That's a great question, and obviously in the retail space in particular, it's a challenge, but also you mentioned just in many industries going on down the service line where the service technician is out in the field. We see this being embedded in actually the call center applications themselves, where oftentimes now in sophisticated call center software, they're recording every conversation. You always get that kind of default answer. And the agent can actually check the box and associate the verbal portion of that consent back to the profile via the call center software that they're in and day out anyway. So that's through an API that we're seeing that take place. And then same thing for the, if you go right down to the retail associate kind of store level in retail, oftentimes it's at the point of sale on the cash register. They don't have a handheld device with them. They aren't in the mobile world. But again, at the point of sale, some of these things can be captured and embedded into the point of sale technology as well. Again, API driven is what we've seen. So it's kind of becoming a part of the service or retail experience for the retailer or the service organization or the call center, where those users live versus a whole separate and distinct workflow for them.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
One more
you.
question?
Yeah.